How Britain ruled 56 countries. The biggest empire in history. At its height in 1920, one government in London gave orders that touched a quarter of the Earth's land and a quarter of its people. Canada obeyed it. So did Australia, India, Egypt, Nigeria, Jamaica, and dozens more. Ships flying one flag patrolled every ocean on the planet. No empire before or since, not Rome, not the Mongols, not Spain, ever controlled this much territory at once. This is the story of how a small, rain-soaked island off the coast of Europe built an empire on which, famously, the sun never set, and how it eventually lost every last piece of it. 56 nations today trace part of their history, their borders, even their official language, back to British rule. This is how that happened, and what it actually cost. Part 1. The merchants who built an empire. Tudor-era ships, East India Company seal. Britain's empire didn't begin with soldiers. It began with a trading license. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, calling themselves the East India Company. Their goal was simple: get in on the spice trade that Portugal and the Netherlands already dominated. Nobody involved imagined this company would eventually govern the Indian subcontinent, raise its own private army larger than most European nations, and effectively rule 250 million people. But that's exactly what happened. Over the next 2 centuries, the company shifted from trading pepper and cotton to collecting taxes, administering justice, and waging war. First against rival European powers, then against Indian states themselves. By the 1757 Battle of Plassey, where company forces under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal, the transformation from business to government was well underway. Bengal's treasury was drained to fund further conquest. Within decades, the company controlled most of the subcontinent, answering to shareholders in London more than to the people it ruled. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different model of empire was taking shape. Starting with Jamestown in 1607 and the Plymouth colony in 1620, English settlers established colonies up and down the eastern coast of North America, not through corporate conquest, but through settlement, often at devastating cost to the indigenous nations already living there. The Caribbean followed a third model entirely: sugar islands like Barbados and Jamaica, run on the forced labor of enslaved Africans, generating enormous wealth for absentee plantation owners back in Britain. 3 different methods: corporate rule, settler colonization, and plantation slavery, all converging under one crown. By the mid-1700s, Britain had built the outline of something the world hadn't seen before. Part 2. The First Empire falls, the Second rises. American Revolution scenes. Map of empire shifting. Then, in 1783, Britain lost its biggest colonial project. 13 American colonies, tired of taxation without representation, fought and won their independence. It should have been a fatal blow. Instead, it was a pivot point. Historians often describe what came next as a Second British Empire, less focused on white settler colonies governing themselves, more focused on direct control of non-European territories, rich in resources and strategically valuable trade routes. India became the crown jewel. Australia, claimed by Captain Cook in 1770, became first a penal colony, then a settler nation built on the displacement of Aboriginal peoples. The Napoleonic Wars accelerated everything. Fighting France for control of the seas, Britain picked up colonies almost as a side effect of victory. The Cape Colony in southern Africa, Ceylon, Malta, and various Caribbean islands changed hands from French or Dutch control to British. By 1815, the Royal Navy had no serious rival on any ocean, and that naval supremacy became the backbone of everything that followed. Britain didn't need to occupy every territory it profited from. It just needed to control the sea lanes between them. In 1858, after a massive uprising known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 nearly ended British rule altogether, the East India Company itself was dissolved. The British Crown took direct control of India. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1877, a title that captured the new phase of empire perfectly. No longer merchants with muskets, but a state formally ruling distant peoples as subjects, not citizens. Part 3. The Scramble and the Peak, Berlin Conference Map, African Colonial Borders. The late 1800s brought the fastest phase of expansion in the empire's history, the scramble for Africa. In 1884 and 1885, European powers met in Berlin and divided the African continent among themselves, without a single African representative in the room. Britain walked away with Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, and more. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate turned imperialist, dreamed openly of a British Africa stretching unbroken from Cairo to Cape Town. He never quite achieved it, but he came close. By 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the British Empire covered roughly 13 million square miles, about a quarter of all the land on Earth, and ruled over 412 million people, also close to a quarter of humanity at the time. It included territories on every inhabited continent, Canada and the Caribbean in the Americas, dozens of African colonies, India and Burma and Malaya and Hong Kong in Asia, Australia and New Zealand, and a scattering of Pacific islands in Oceania. It was, by any measure, the largest empire in recorded history. Larger than the Mongol Empire, larger than Rome at its height, larger than the Spanish Empire at its peak. The empire reached its absolute territorial maximum not before the war, but after it. When Germany and the Ottoman Empire lost the First World War, their overseas territories were redistributed as League of Nations mandates, and Britain picked up Palestine, Iraq, Tanganyika, and more. By 1922, the empire held sway, directly or indirectly, over roughly 458 million people across territories that would eventually become the 56-plus nations we mentioned at the start. Part 4. How do you rule a quarter of the world? Colonial administrators, railway construction, courtroom. Ruling that much territory with a relatively small home population required a specific playbook, and Britain refined it over 3 centuries. Indirect rule was the preferred tool wherever possible. Rather than replacing local power structures, British administrators frequently governed through them, propping up a sultan here, a maharaja there, a chief somewhere else, so long as they cooperated with British interests. This was cheaper than direct administration and gave the appearance of continuity, even as real power shifted to a British resident advisor, standing just behind the throne. Divide and rule was the second pillar. Colonial administrators frequently emphasized, or even hardened, ethnic, religious, and caste divisions within colonized societies, on the theory that a divided population was easier to control than a unified one. In India, British policy increasingly categorized and separated Hindu and Muslim political representation. In Africa, colonial mapmakers drew borders that ignored existing ethnic and linguistic boundaries entirely, merging rival groups into single colonies or splitting single peoples across several decisions whose consequences are still being felt in border conflicts today. Infrastructure and extraction went hand in hand. Britain built railways across India and Africa, an achievement colonial apologists still point to today. But the lines were designed overwhelmingly to move raw materials from the interior to coastal ports for export, not to serve local development. Cotton, tea, rubber, gold, diamonds, and grain flowed outward to British factories and British markets. Finished manufactured goods flowed back in, often undercutting and destroying local industries that had existed for centuries. India, once responsible for roughly a quarter of global manufacturing output before colonization, saw that share collapse under company and crown rule. Legal and educational systems completed the picture. English common law, English language schooling for colonial elites, and English-style civil services were exported across the empire, creating administrative classes that could run the machinery of empire locally, and eventually, the very independence movements that would dismantle it. Part 5. The human cost famine imagery, approached carefully. Historical photographs, memorial sites. No honest account of the British Empire can skip this part, and we won't. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed an estimated 3 million people in a period when historians widely agree British wartime policy. Grain exports continuing even as food shortages worsened, and a slow, inadequate relief response significantly worsened the death toll. It was not the only colonial famine. Repeated famines in British India through the 19th century killed tens of millions combined, and economic historians continue to debate how much colonial trade and taxation policy turned droughts into mass starvation events. The transatlantic slave trade is inseparable from British imperial wealth. British ships carried an estimated 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between the 1600s and 1807, when Britain abolished the trade itself, though slavery in British colonies continued until 1833, and Britain compensated slave owners, not the enslaved, for the loss of property. That compensation debt was so large, it wasn't fully paid off by British taxpayers until 2015. Violent suppression of resistance recurs throughout imperial history. The 1919 Amritsar massacre in India, where troops under British command fired on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. The brutal suppression of the Mau Mau uprising in 1950s Kenya, which involved detention camps and treatment that the British government formally apologized for and paid compensation over in 2013. The Anglo-Boer concentration camps in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century, where tens of thousands of Boer and Black African civilians died of disease and malnutrition. None of this erases the roads, railways, and institutions the empire also built. But a full accounting of how Britain ruled 56 countries has to include how much of that rule rested on violence, extraction, and the denial of self-governance to the people actually living there. Part 6. The Empire Comes Apart. Independence Celebrations. India, 1947. African nations, 1960s. The end came faster than the beginning. 2 world wars had bankrupted Britain and discredited the idea that European powers had any natural right to rule other continents. Independence movements, many led by figures educated in the very British institutions built to sustain the empire, grew impossible to suppress without costs Britain could no longer bear, financially or morally. India and Pakistan won independence in 1947, in a partition that triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history and horrific communal violence. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957. Nigeria followed in 1960, Kenya in 1963. Through the 1960s and into the 1980s, colony after colony became sovereign nation, sometimes peacefully negotiated, sometimes only after years of armed struggle. Hong Kong, the last major territory, was handed back to China in 1997. In place of empire, Britain built the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of 56 independent nations, most of them former colonies, that still exists today. It has no power to command any of them. That itself is the measure of how completely the empire ended.
Before we go deeper, our goal on this video is to get 500 likes and share your reaction in the comments. Subscribe to the channel